We begin our report in Europe, where three nations have made a gesture to the Palestinians. The leaders of Spain, Ireland, and Norway said they will recognize a Palestinian state, which they had not done before. The Wednesday announcements come 7.5 months after the start of the war in Gaza, and despite Israel's repeated objections. They join more than a dozen European nations that have already done so. Many countries, including the United States, advocate for a two-state solution, but the Biden administration argues the move must be negotiated. CBS News foreign correspondent Imtiaz Tyab has more. Imtiaz?
Well, this is an extraordinary move by the leaders of these three countries to formally recognize a Palestinian state. In a statement, they all collectively said that this was a time for peace and made it clear that they believe that peace and safety could only be achieved through the recognition of a Palestinian state and indeed the safety of future generations of Israelis and Palestinians. But, of course, as we've been hearing, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu reacted with fury, saying that this was not the time to recognize a Palestinian state, saying that it was, quote, a reward for Hamas. In fact, we've heard from Israel's finance minister saying that he will also suspend tax transfer payments to the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is already strapped for money, and this is certainly going to be a very punitive measure for them. But we have to be clear, between a potential arrest warrant for alleged war crimes that the ICC is pursuing for Prime Minister Netanyahu, the unilateral recognition of a Palestinian state by these European powers, and we've been hearing anguished pleas from hostage families to bring their loved ones home. The Israeli leadership, Prime Minister Netanyahu specifically, is under extraordinary pressure from all sides as he desperately tries to cling on to power. John.
Imtiaz Tyab, thank you. And now we go to CBS News chief foreign affairs correspondent and Face the Nation moderator Margaret Brennan, who joins me. Margaret, help me understand what Norway, Ireland, and Spain are up to here, the role this plays in this question of a Palestinian state, and is this purely symbolic?
Well, John, it's symbolic in that it doesn't have a practical implication on the ground for independence, but it is aspirational and shows that Israel's increasingly isolated. It's now like 140 of the 190 countries at the UN have recognized a Palestinian state. The United States says they want one, but as the result of a negotiated settlement with Israel to work out how this would actually take place. They also currently, the Biden administration, are trying to have a complete revitalization of the Palestinian Authority, which is the governing entity in the West Bank, so that it has younger, more capable, less corrupt officials running it. But this is also something that there are members of the war cabinet who are supportive of within Israel. You had the defense minister of Israel, Gallant, coming out and saying that this needs to be talked about, who's going to run this place, Gaza, after Israeli troops leave. And that debate over whether Israel would actually try to take over control and hold it is something that far-right nationalist ministers of the Netanyahu government are pressing for. And that's why this is also so delicate.
Adding to this discussion is the question of Saudi Arabia. On Capitol Hill, Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke about efforts to normalize relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Here's some of what he said.
In order for normalization to proceed, Saudi Arabia has made very clear that even with the agreements between us completed, they have to have two things. They have to have calm in Gaza, and they have to have a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. Whether a government in Israel in this moment is able to engage on that basis, I don't know.
So there we hear it again, support for a Palestinian state. How do you read into, there were a lot of ums in Blinken's testimony. How do you read into the ums and the delicate dance the U.S. is trying to do here with the Saudis?
Oh, that was very delicate, John. And I really would have loved a sharp follow-up question to the I don't know, because Antony Blinken was really trying to avoid taking on the complications within the Israeli political system right now when he was answering that, and also avoid saying that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been completely defiant of all requests to date that President Biden has been making of him, including on this, which President Biden has sought as this sort of crown achievement to deliver to Israel a security compact by normalizing relations with Saudi Arabia, the most influential and important Arab Muslim country in the world. That's the carrot that President Biden is dangling out there, saying, hey, if you want to cement your legacy as actually making Israel more secure, then perhaps do this and compromise on the Palestinian state element of this. But it is not at all clear that Prime Minister Netanyahu would make that calculation. And in fact, the Biden administration officials have increasingly been saying that they believe he is making calculations based on his own political survival and not necessarily the security of the state. And you heard a member of his war cabinet suggest as much as well, Benny Gantz gesturing to it.
Let me switch to Ukraine before you have to go, Margaret. Last week, Blinken visited Kyiv to reiterate U.S. support for Ukraine. What for you is what is the key issue right now in that conflict that you're paying attention to?
Well, John, the ambassador from Ukraine was on Face the Nation this weekend and said there's no such thing as fast enough when it comes to delivery of weapons. The reason that this moment is so sensitive is because of that delay and of 6 months or more in delivery. And Russia has really been able to exploit it in a significant way. At a time when Ukraine is even short on troops, they just rolled out a new draft, for example. So they need everything, on the weapons front, including air cover. They're asking for 2 Patriot systems. They're asking for other kind of support as well, including training of their troops, more of it. And where that takes place, who does it, all of that is still being worked out.
And President Zelensky wants, at least based on his remarks in the New York Times, on Tuesday, he wants NATO to shoot down Russian missiles that have entered Ukrainian airspace. He says that's just defending us. That's not an aggressive act. How big of an ask, really, though, is that for Zelensky?
Bigger than anything NATO has been willing to do to date. That New York Times interview, he laid out a number of prescriptive things that NATO has just not been willing to do, the Biden administration has not been willing to do. And he points out that the United States was willing to do that for Israel, for example. Israel's an ally of the United States. Ukraine is not a treaty ally of the United States, nor is it part of NATO. And the United States to date has really been trying to walk that line of not escalating. Using anything under the NATO brand is super sensitive because Vladimir Putin's trumped up version of events is that he's at war with NATO, and the U.S. doesn't want to give cover for any of that. And that applies as well to the training of troops, whether those are conducted by NATO or whether those are conducted by members of NATO is parsed here. Diplomats are okay with members of NATO doing training. They're a little more sensitive when anything under the NATO umbrella gets involved.
Face the Nation's Margaret Brennan. Thank you so much, Margaret.
Thanks, John.